I would now like to welcome our first speaker. Laili has an MA in Conflict Studies, a BA honors in Criminology and Criminal Justice, with a concentration in law and a social service worker diploma. Laili has nearly 20 years of interdisciplinary experience in criminal justice and social service fields. She has experience designing and implementing strategies to reduce gang-related crime and violence as a community program officer with our CMP, an Onion Lake Cree Nation, and a project manager with the Work Skills Employment Center in Ottawa. Laili has worked with government and community services and crime prevention, victim and witness services in federal and criminal prosecutions, community restorative justice programs, youth custody and detention centers, addictions, residential harm reduction programs, emergency housing and shelters. She has worked in several provinces and territories in Canada, including the Prairie and Arctic regions, with internship and volunteer experience in Nepal, India, and Ghana. Laili is a recipient of 2018 Community Policing Award from the Saskatchewan Association of Chiefs of Police. These are just a few of her accomplishments and experiences. Laili will now speak to us about rising threats from the ultra-right-wing hate groups and Muslim extremists. Please join me in welcoming Laili Yazdani.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We'll just wait a second for the PowerPoint to come up there. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you for having me. Maybe as I'm just waiting for things to get up there. So I'm here from the Organization for the Prevention of Violence. My title is I'm a senior interventionist, so I work on the provincial intervention program called the Evolve program, and I'll be speaking a bit about that later on. Maybe just before we get started, this is a topic that can obviously raise a lot of different feelings and emotions. So I'm just going to kind of put that out there. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask. I know there's going to be a designated time later. And feel free to approach me afterwards as well. Yeah. But I'm very happy to be here, and maybe we'll just get rolling, because we got limited time. So I have a few things I'm hoping to go through. So first I'll give just a brief introduction of what we do. At OPV we call for short, because it's a very long title. I'll go over a couple key terms, although I'm not going to use too many of them, but I think there's a lot of terms that maybe some of us have heard in the media, for example, and sometimes there's a lot of confusion as to what this actually means. So I'm just going to share the terms that we use with OPV, with the research we've done in Alberta. Then I'll go over some of the risk factors that we've identified so far, when is a good time to get help in the unlikely event that someone may come across someone who's kind of expressing views that may be considered extremist. After that, I'll go over a little bit about the work that we do with our provincial intervention program that I mentioned earlier, called the Evolve program. And then I'll briefly go over some of the resources that are available here in the province for anyone who's looking to get out of the extremist or hate motivated group, someone who's been affected by hate crime, and ways, different options that are available for reporting these incidences. And then I have my contact info at the end. So, if we get here, so the OPV has been around technically since 2016. It is a non-profit organization, and we do have a provincial mandate in the province of Alberta. However, there is one little exception, because here in Calgary there is a project called Project Redirect. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. So they function here in the city. We can go anywhere else, anywhere else in the province, and then we can work collaboratively as well, and we have actually one case. So we bring together community members, academics, and different service practitioners to address this complicated issue together. And what we offer at the OPV is research, outreach services, and intervention services to communities. So we have funding from Public Safety Canada primarily for our services, but we also receive some funding from Reach Edmonton, and we also received a gift from the city of Edmonton. We are one of two NGOs, nonprofit organizations, focusing on this area in Canada. So the other one is in Quebec, and we are the only one that actually has a provincial mandate. So we are a little bit unique there. With our funding, we have a provincial intervention program, as I mentioned. We also have the Resiliency Project, which is a collaboration with the Edmonton Police Service and the City of Edmonton. And so together we deliver training initiatives to frontline service providers and community leaders on these topics. So if you go to the next slide, please. So a few key terms. I'm not going to go through all of them because I actually forgot to write them here in my notes. We generally stay away from the term radicalization, although we have our own definition here, because this is a word that's often been used in various ways and often has some kind of negative stigmatizing effects. So, but we do use the term ideology, extremism, and extremist violence. So I'm not going to read through all of it, but you can see there that we have the definitions for terrorism and hate, like a hate crime, under the Criminal Code of Canada. And yeah, we'll go forward from here. So, from our research, there was research done in 2018 in several communities in Alberta. There were surveys and interviews done, I think up to about 120 interviews actually with different individuals. So from law enforcement, from community service providers, community leaders, including individuals and families affected by this issue, whether that's engaging in violence or being affected by it. So in 2019, these results were released to the public. And I think what's interesting to discuss here is that through the research, specifically in this province, there are 6 different types of groups that were identified, which is actually very helpful because sometimes there's been focuses on certain types of violence in this area. So the first 4 you can see, they've labeled them as Al-Qaeda, its affiliate and splinter groups, so that would include ISIS or Daesh, for example, anti-authority and anti-government groups, patriot and militia groups, white supremacy and associated ideologies. So those 4 would be considered right-wing extremism. Then there's also single-issue groups. Sometimes they're individuals, sometimes they're affiliated with groups, and this could be, depending on the issue, it could be right or left-wing, kind of in the center, it depends. And then you have the far left as well. So I'm just going to go over a few of these briefly, and maybe just go over a few points that might be helpful for people to know. So recently in Alberta, there has been a decline in the engagement in this particular area. However, there was more involvement specifically in Alberta since about 2012, and Edmonton was actually disproportionately affected by these issues. That being said, there's been one of the issues that's kind of been, well, it's been a big issue for Alberta, especially Edmonton, is the fact that this example of foreign fighters, for example. So there was approximately 30 to 40 individuals from Edmonton, for example, that traveled abroad to join different conflicts. So that includes Syria. So there's been a number of different challenges there. So in the past, perhaps, with some people, such as Bin Laden, talking about focusing on the West as the enemy, then there were, changes with that. So with Daesh and ISIS, recruiting people to go overseas to join these conflicts. And now recently, if you've read in the media, there are concerns about people that are now in detainment camps and what will happen to them. And the majority are actually women and children at this point. There has been some people that have returned, approximately 10% have returned to Alberta. However, most people that did travel overseas are deceased. So this is one particular area that we're looking at and working with in the PD. And we have a community partnership to try to help address this issue in the event that people are returning to Canada. In terms of recruitment, there are some different trends that have happened here. And you may have read about some of this in the media. There's been a lot of online communication strategies. So whether that's with magazines such as Inspire, there's been different videos, and there's been a big increase in the use of anonymous and encrypted social media platforms. So that could be things like Telegram, Signal, or WhatsApp. And so in terms of recruitment trends, sometimes when people are online, there's also a lot of activity on Twitter, for example. There are people out there that are paying attention, they'll send messages, and then they'll quickly, if they are in an open kind of social media platform, they'll quickly get them to change into an encrypted platform, where then they're able to have more personal kind of conversations and even connect with others. And this also presents some challenges for different agencies trying to address these issues, such as law enforcement, for example. And one of the areas that there's been more of concentration is what has been termed Salafi jihadism, and how things have been misappropriated to justify the use of violence in this area. Just before I switch, I should explain there are some photos there that we're using to try to be helpful. So the first one is Anwar al-Awlaki. So he has been influential in terms of, he has a number of videos online, although he is deceased now. He's been quite influential in this movement. The image underneath is what's called the Black Standard flag. So that's been used by Daesh and ISIS, for example. So we just include some of these photos in case in the unlikely event that anyone might come across these things or hear someone talking about them. You never know. And then the person underneath this is the person, Abdullahi Sharif, was recently convicted in Edmonton for the van attack a couple of years ago. So although he wasn't prosecuted for a terrorism charge, there was stuff in the media, and I guess I'm not sure about it during the trial, but there was the ISIS flag or Daesh flag found in his car at the time. So the next group, oh, sorry, there was a video, but I think we don't have sound, so we'll just skip that for now, that's okay. So the next is what's considered anti-authority and anti-government groups. And this actually represents the most common type of extremist activity in Alberta, which is interesting for people to know. And so this includes individuals that have maybe some general or semi-structured beliefs and attitudes that would be considered kind of against the government or authority figures. This can lead to a type of fixation on particular issues, and then lead to threats against, for example, politicians, governments, or officials. And sometimes it's very interesting how these things come about to be. So in the research, they found that sometimes people will have these kind of general beliefs, but then because of personal issues, maybe they're a sudden divorce or other personal issues like suddenly losing a job, that little tipping points such as getting a ticket will somehow lead into these kinds of things and can lead to violence. There are a small minority, however, within this general group that actually do engage in violence, so I think that's important to know. At the top there, you'll see, this is a sign actually from the UK. I've tried to really just include pictures from Canada and Alberta, but this is a sign from the UK. So some of these groups, one of the bigger ones is called Freedom of the Land. So they use arguments from, like before Constitution, so they claim that they haven't agreed to have the government rule over them, and so there's a preference not to have government ID, for example, and then this presents issues. For example, if someone gets a speeding ticket, and there was a case in Edmonton where that happened, the person took a video of a police officer, posted it online, and then started to file numerous claims in court that was tying up the court system. So it's very interesting. And then sometimes groups will create their own documents, as you can see in the second picture there. And then underneath, there's even been individuals that have created their own kind of badges for their groups. Then there are patriot and militia groups. So there's been a general increase in this area in Alberta since about 2015, and it's led to protests in 2018, primarily in Edmonton. Some of the members of these groups may also be associated with other groups that have white supremacist types of beliefs. Some of them will pose as security guards at events such as protests, and that includes members of what's called the 3% movement. There are mixed memberships within these groups, and so there's often feuds for leadership and what they would consider would be their shared goals. It's hard to bring a lot of people with different views together. So sometimes this leads to infighting and splits within the group. However, at this point, there is they haven't been involved in violence at this point, despite some of the concerns in the media. But I think it's also interesting to note that while there is kind of a link with this, with some groups with white supremacy, that in Alberta, in the early 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan was in Alberta, so this is not necessarily something new, and there is a bit of history there. Maybe before we switch, so that first picture, that is from a group at the time that was called, that was Soldiers of Odin. They've changed their names, to my understanding, quite a few times, sorry. So there's Soldiers of Odin, Wolves of Odin, I believe now some members are calling themselves the Clan, with a K. Underneath is a symbol from the group, the Three Percenters. And they were here actually recently in Calgary. I'm not sure if people here are aware. And so even though they, to our understanding, have not been engaged in violence, they were carrying, it's called a cattle stun gun, is what you can see the person holding. So that could be considered a weapon if it was used. So that's pretty interesting. And the picture from the top, that was from a rally that the soldiers of Olden were engaged in at the Royal Canadian Legion in Grande Prairie. So this leads us to white supremacy and associated ideologies. So as I mentioned before, this has been present in Alberta since about the 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, thereabouts. So the significance and the organization of these groups, however, have only really existed for relatively brief periods of time. Between 2006 and 2018, there was quite a bit of activity, including violence and crimes committed by what was called the Aryan Guard, later Blood and Honor, and then their armed wing, which is called the Combat 18. So they were engaged in a number of assaults, homicides, and they randomly would target different members of minority groups. Some of these groups may also be involved or claim to be part of a political party or be primarily trying to achieve political agendas. There's also been some similar recruitment trends with this group. So there's also the use of anonymous and encrypted social media platforms. And there are some that have argued that some strategies, what sometimes now is called the lone actor violence, was actually started in white supremacist groups. So this is quite interesting. So there is a new generation of white nationalists, and they're called sometimes called identitarians, sometimes they're still called white nationalists, or the alt-right, for example. And for whatever reason, they've been a bit more successful in attracting kind of younger generations, and some people that may be considered from the mainstream, I guess, of society. And they have a very different look compared to, let's say some time ago in the 80s and 90s, the skinhead kind of look. So they tend to be people that are wearing suits, they have crew cuts, and it's a very different way of presenting these issues. So the top picture there was the leader, I believe he's left now, Kyle McKee. This was a group I should have mentioned that was very active in Calgary. So he's since left. I'm not sure where the organizational structure of this group is at now. Underneath is what's called the Turner Diaries, which is pretty interesting. So this was written by William Pierce, who's a physicist actually. It's a fictional novel that depicts a story in the near future where a group of individuals feel that white society is under threat and that they're against the government, and they overthrow the government in this novel. Even though this is a fictional novel, it is quite influential with white supremacist groups, and it's often on people's bookshelves if they're involved in this group, so it's just a good thing to note. It also led to the creation of an actual terrorist group. It was labeled as a terrorist group in the States called The Order by Daniel Lane, so it's been quite influential. Underneath is a logo of the identitarian group with, I guess this is meant to represent Canada with the maple leaf underneath. So next we have single issue groups. And these groups can engage in violence depending on what it is, but normally these would be groups that are very particular about the issues that they're addressing. So sometimes that would be environmental concerns, animal rights. I'm not saying that they necessarily engage in violence, but it is possible. However, this one kind of emerging group that is getting more members is called the involuntary celibate movement, or sometimes called incel for short, which you may have heard of in the media. So that second picture there is of the person who in California, it's Elliot Rogers. So he had used a car and injured and killed women for the purpose of, this movement is really about, they advocate and sometimes engage in violence against women, and it's because they say that they're not able to have a successful intimate relationship with a woman. So unfortunately this has inspired some other incidences, including the Toronto van attack. And there was a case actually in Edmonton. So this individual underneath, I forget his first name, I think it's Shane Bentley, yes. So he was a security guard who identified as an incel, and he was convicted for killing a homeless man. He kicked him to death, actually. And he claimed that it was because of work stress as well as being an incel, and his frustrations with being an incel. So now we come to the last group, which is the far left. And sometimes this has been received with mixed results. But this is primarily a group that has emerged in reaction to the far right, to far right extremists. So they've been most active in response to the Aryan Guard and Blood and Honor groups. And now they've been more active in protests more recently. When violence does occur, it's usually engaged with law enforcement who are trying to dispel confrontations, or members of the far right groups. So one that has received more attention recently is called Antifa. It stands for anti-fascist. And so they use different tactics, like they're often present in different protests. As you can see there, there's a flag, a person dressed in black. They often cover their face. And so while I believe they have not engaged in violence so far, there are some members that will carry like batons and things with them that could be used.
That's ridiculous.
Groups,
Extremely violent Antifa.
Uses kind of what would be termed as doxing tactics. So they identify people that have been engaged in far-right groups, and they will name them, name the activities, and put this on.
Her credibility as a speaker has gone down
so while
the
some people may
tube.
agree with this, it definitely presents us with a challenge when we're
Pathetic.
trying to help people leave extremist groups. This presents a lot of extra challenges for an individual if they want to change their life around. However, this type of behavior, it has been happening. It's been used to really cause a lot of pressure and make people uncomfortable from different communities. But basically what doxing is, it's taking information that's readily available on the internet, public information, and then putting it all together and putting it basically in kind of one post that may include a photo and different information about a person. So, yeah, that's it for that one. So now we get to a little bit of a discussion on risk factors and warning signs. This is still an emerging kind of area to specifically focus on, but what we have been finding, and there is research out there, is that there's often a few key trends. However, every individual is of course different, and some of these risk factors are common to people who may be vulnerable to other types of criminal violence, so it's not necessarily specific, which is interesting. So there often is a history of mental health issues and trauma, but when we talk about mental health issues, I think it's important to say that there is research out there saying that, for example, when a person has a mental illness, they're often more at risk of being a victim of crime, and I think that's good to mention here. But sometimes what it is when a person is, let's say, depressed or anxious, having suicidal thoughts, if that's an ongoing issue that has not been resolved, that can be a long-term stressor for an individual, such as Alexander Bissonnette, who was engaged in the Quebec mosque shooting, and a few others. The trauma here, that word is often used in different ways. And when I'm seeing with some individuals that I work with, it's often some pretty severe unresolved childhood trauma and abuse. So I think that's very interesting to note here. There's often a lack of positive attachments mixed with isolation, which is sometimes the result of the experience of trauma. So those things combined can create a very difficult situation for a person if they're not willing to get help for themselves, so it may get expressed in other ways. And then I already mentioned long-term stress and declining job and school performance. So there have been some cases that have been reported, and suddenly a person may be having a lot of difficulties, but then there might be, a sudden divorce, loss of job, as I mentioned before. That seems to maybe be a tipping point for some individuals, not everyone, but that can happen. So we just include a little portion here when we do presentations on when it would be good to get help. So again, it is unlikely, and we're not expecting high numbers of people engaged in these groups. They're actually quite low, especially if you compare it to other types of criminal activity, gangs, for example, where there's large numbers of membership. In this area, it's pretty small. But we still, with awareness training, we do try to include this component that in the unlikely event that you do encounter someone who starts to express certain things, or you're worried about them, what can you do and what can you look for? And a lot of it, again, is just general to a person who's struggling. So if there is a person that's communicating a non-specific intent to hurt others, it could be a threat, but it's not very specific. Let's say they don't identify a particular community, but they're saying, I just had enough, so I'm going to get out there and do something. This is something that would be important to pay attention to. Identifying or fixating on a specific grievance or ideology, a grievance being, it could be something that's very personal to them, something they've experienced personally, or that they feel is affecting what they consider their community. Changes in social networks, so suddenly either becoming very isolated or changing their close friends and being secretive about that. Associating with people involved in an extremist group, this is a pretty big one here, because obviously if there is access and someone is engaging with someone already engaged that's in these groups, it just kind of increases the risk. And a sudden change in social stability. So those would be some of the examples I gave before with marital relationships and work, for example. I think it's also important here to also mention that in some of the research that has been done, there was about 70% of cases where people did disclose their intentions. So I think, as scary as that can be for some people, I think it's also interesting to know because it's an opportunity that then, for prevention, that something can be done with the right supports in place. So the next part, so talking about extremism, which can be pretty heavy. But if someone is talking about things that maybe can seem considered extremist, it's important, as difficult as it may be, to kind of listen, show respect and empathy, because if a person is disclosing this to someone, it's probably because they have a relationship with them and they trust them, and at least they're talking about it and not doing it. So it's important to do that. Often when we go and do presentations, we often will ask, what do you think you would do if you were ever found in this unusual situation? And often we are met with, 5 minutes, okay, good. Often we're met with, well, I would confront the person, I would tell them this isn't right, and that does not work. So that's why we have that point there. It's usually through relationship building and addressing a lot of times immediate needs that we're able to really kind of work with people and change those things around. So you can kind of read the other ones there, but I'm very quickly running out of time, so I'm going to keep going.
No mention of the extremism
So
out of the government or the media, the fake mainstream media. Unbelievable.
You can also support their family members that have been involved or affected by extremist or hate-motivated crimes or incidences. So we assist individuals who are looking to leave an extremist or hate-motivated group, but we can also provide support to their families. And we're trying to expand now the other part of our program, which is to help victims. So our services are free, voluntary, and confidential. So there are, of course, reasonable limits to confidentiality. If there was ever a concern for the immediate safety of the individual or the public, that is obviously something we have to report to police. Other than that, we are trying to work with individuals to address their needs and to try to turn things around. I'm not going to say too much about this because I have limited time, but this is kind of the foundation of our intervention program. So we use a relationship-based practice because we need to establish trust with individuals to really work well with them, especially because this is an area that causes a lot of fear sometimes, and a lot of people are not comfortable talking about these issues. So our clients often feel like they don't really have anyone that they can talk to, and they're worried about what will happen if they do. So this is really important. We have trauma-informed practice, we use a harm reduction approach, we use attachment theory to try to build those healthy relationships in the community, and we also work with community members, informal and actual supports. So this is our case management approach. I'll just touch upon this briefly. So we have, I do the case management piece with individuals, but then I work within a team. So in our team, we have a forensic psychologist, a social worker, and we work with different consultants and mentors. So it's wonderful to have our forensic psychologist there because if you remember, I mentioned that often there's a lot of unaddressed issues from a long time ago with our clients. So our counselor is able to meet with them fairly quickly. There's really no wait list unless it's other clients, but and it's a free service, so that's a real benefit. And then we work with different mentors. So we have an Imam that has experience in this area working with someone. So if we do have someone that says, I think I'm starting to question kind of what I believe, and is there someone we'd like to talk to about this? Well, yes, there is. And then the same with if someone's involved in, let's say, a white supremacist movement, we work with a former white supremacist leader, actually, that has been helping people exit from these groups for quite some time. What it looks like for the client is...
We're going to address her after she's finished. She's just finishing up here, but
from weekly visits
oh my God.
to...
She's a non-profit group. It's funded by the provincial government, federal government, basically labeling people different names, categorizing them.
When you're trying to get a job. So we can do
But we're going to ask her some questions directly afterwards.
Because I'm almost done. That was a video, so we can skip that one. So when to call police, I think this is important. And I lost my slide here. Here it is. So I think the difference between when a person can maybe benefit from support and when it's really important to call police is obviously when you feel like there would be an emergency. So if a person is disclosing a violent intent and a specific plan, that is definitely a call for police. If they are attempting to recruit others, and if they're demonstrating what would be considered clear pre-attack indicators, so acquiring, trying to get weapons, bomb-making manuals, building and gaining access to hidden spaces. That can include, suddenly locking a door in the basement or using a shed that no one really goes in. So trying to find these hidden spaces. Carrying out and documenting dry runs. So Alexander Bissonnette, for example, had organized to practice what he intended to do, even though it actually wasn't a mosque, it was a mall, which is very interesting. But this does happen with some individuals. And just in terms of resources, so of course there's your local police. So if you are concerned about an individual and you feel that it is a call for police, and honestly, if you're not sure, just call if you feel comfortable. And especially to report a hate crime or incident. I know that in doing presentations, sometimes we're asked, what's the difference? Citizens are not, community members are not expected to make that decision on their own. If you're not sure, just phone the police. And I think it's important to mention, if you believe an incident is hate motivated, it's important to mention that. Because in Edmonton, for example, there's an extremist and hate unit crime, or hate crimes unit, excuse me. So that will get flagged and go directly to that unit, and then they can look at it and do a specific investigation. I've already mentioned our organization. There's the RCMP. They have community liaison officers and engagement officers, and their role is to build relationships. And if you're not sure about the detachment number, obviously we're in Calgary, so it's a bit different, but it's always good to know that you can just call 310 RCMP and you'll be directed to the appropriate place. And the second last slide, sorry I'm rushing. So a few other resources. We do have a speaker from the group up there, so National Council of Canadian Muslims, so people can report a hate-motivated crime or incident there online. There's also Stop Hate AB, which is a newer initiative, and that's specifically to report hate incidences, so that can also be done online. There's the Alberta Human Rights Commission, so if someone feels that there's a human rights complaint, let's say a person loses their job, and they feel that they've been discriminated against, they can file a human rights complaint in that situation. And then there's Public Safety Canada. They have funds that's available under the Security Infrastructure Program, where people can apply to have matching funds to improve security, for example, on a mosque, if that's felt to be needed, and to train staff. And so, I have now made it to the end, hopefully not over time. I'm sorry it was a bit rushed, but I know we have time in the end for questions, and feel free to approach me with any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laili Yazdani, for this wonderful speech. Our next speaker is a lawyer by profession and executive director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. He published various articles on issues relating to Canadian Muslims' human rights and civil liberties and political issues, including Islamophobia. He has flown all the way from Ottawa to speak to us today. Mustafa will now speak to us about rising hate crimes, Islamophobia, and identity politics in Canada. We are very grateful to have him here. Let's give him a warm Calgary welcome to Mustafa.
Assalamu alaikum, good morning. So, the title of my talk is Rising Hate Crimes,
Islamophobia, and identity politics in Canada. And I would normally ground such a conversation in a very analytical and discursive framework. However, perhaps today it's more appropriate to start with some of the lived realities. It's important to start with the notion that although people come and they try to intimidate us, they try to scare us, they try to make us feel afraid, we will not be intimidated, we are not afraid. Nothing that anyone can do makes us afraid, nothing scares us, and if you people who come to try to scare us have nothing better to do than the day after Valentine's Day to come, to show up, to try to scare folks who just want to listen to a conference, feel free, grab a croissant, sit down, it's going to be a fun day. Now, today, it's February 15th. A little less than a month ago, I was in Quebec City at the 3rd anniversary of the Quebec City mosque attack. And I was sitting beside Imam Dervali. Now, when Alexander Bissonnette attacked, Imam stood up. He got between the gunman and the congregation. As a result, Imam took numerous bullets to his back, and he's now a paraplegic with limited movements in his hands. In fact, every day when he wakes up, he's in constant pain for being shot, and I consider him a hero, and I know that people in this room and Canadians in general, we recognize his act of heroism. Now, the reality is that that is what Islamophobia looks like in Canada. We're talking about threats. That is something that someone lives with every single day. And the victims of the attack on January 29, 2017 continue to live with. I'm going to read from a letter from Mustafa bin Abdullah, who is the president of the Quebec City Mosque. Allow me to give you a non-exhaustive list of Islamophobic acts that we have suffered here in Quebec, starting with the infamous pamphlets that were distributed in neighborhoods surrounding the mosque and being continued by the numerous incidents of the public, by trash talk radio hosts, the huge swastikas painted on the walls of the Grand Mosque, the freshly sliced pig's head with a note wishing Muslims bon appetit, the offensive referendum after Muslims took steps to create our cemetery, leaflets placarded on our walls showing pigs wallowing in their stinking manure and inviting us to the burial of deceased Muslims, the burning of the car of the president of the office of the CCIQ, and human feces thrown on the entry door of the Grand Mosque. There is danger in the house, Mr. Prime Minister, a danger that obliterates memory, exists and reinforces extremism, and unties forth tongues. The reality, then, is that Islamophobia and the impact of what it means to be openly Muslim in Canada is perhaps one of the most crucial questions we can focus on in terms of thinking about the future. Now, I'm often called upon to speak about Islamophobia, to speak about the place of minorities and minority communities, and the place of religious freedom. Today, however, I'm really glad to be speaking about this topic because I think sometimes our conversations get caught up in what some academics call negative rights. That is, we argue that we should have freedom from the actions of the majority, from the tyranny of the majority, in interference with religious practice. This, of course, is codified in the Charter. Our work around religious freedoms often involves those kinds of questions. We fight for the freedom to live undisturbed. Indeed, these last few years have been tragic ones in the way that we have become all too familiar with violence. Violence brought in the words of those who use second-class citizenship as a shield and as a sword. That kind of violence, that kind of discursive violence, is very obvious in the context of NCCM's Bill 21 battle. We cannot talk about populism, we cannot talk about the rise of divisive politics without bringing your attention to one of the biggest civil liberties challenges of our times. That is the passage into law of Bill 21. Now, it was not long ago that we fought for the right to marry between races and the right to vote. These hard-fought battles for civil liberties are a fundamental part of our identity as Canadians. However, in June 2019, the Quebec government took us a step backwards. As many of you already know, the Quebec government has restricted the wearing of religious symbols in several public sector jobs. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. That means that Canadian Jews, Sikhs, and Muslims wake up every single morning to a different set of opportunities than everyone else in Canada. I know that might make some people happy. But the reality is that we have legalized the very thing that we have fought for decades to overcome: discrimination and second-class citizenship. And we all bear a collective responsibility for this. The new law in Quebec ensures that Canadians do not come to work with their full selves and their full creativity and richness. Instead of forging our future with our invaluable diversity, this new law creates workplaces that are dysfunctional and hostile. It creates workplaces where colleagues are supported by the law to snitch on each other for wearing a kippah or a turban. It's a place where teachers from religious minorities will feel bullied into changing who they are in order to feel accepted and to go about doing their jobs. I mean, if we just think about it for a second, it's 2020, and a Jewish man wearing a kippah can't become a teacher in Quebec. That is disgusting, and it's reprehensible. And it's also, something that I think we should all also at the same time, while noting our deep disgust for this law, simultaneously recognize that the City of Calgary very courageously, and there are activists in this room who fought very hard to make that happen, passed a motion condemning Bill 21, and we thank the City of Calgary for that. However, today, as a nation, we face criticism from the United Nations on Bill 21, and the world watches as Quebec makes some of the most vulnerable populations even more vulnerable as they stand to lose their jobs for expressing something that they thought should always be free and welcome in Canada. But if we take a step back from the question of Bill 21, we also have the very obvious, and I think was already very correctly and prominently highlighted by the speaker before me, the question of obliquely white supremacist organizations across Canada. I want to talk about the 3%ers. So the 3%ers, as we've already been talked about, as also called the 3% or the Threepers, began as a militia group which was built around constitutional rights, especially around the Second Amendment in the United States. Now, eventually, one of those chapters was actually opened in Alberta, which is now one of those group's largest chapters. And as has been reported, this group became quite active in Canada after Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister. According to media reports, the 3%ers are, and I quote, now a nationwide anti-Islam, far-right militia that conducts military-style training and prepping in preparation for a perceived incoming invasion of a left-wing, incoming Islamic invasion of a left-wing government in Canada. End quote. Now, the 3%ers' preoccupation with Islam and Muslims is of particular concern. This group promotes a culture of paranoia, fear, and conspiracy theories within its ranks. They openly express and conduct activities based on their perceived threat of Islam. This group has also made it clear that they have no reservations in theory about using violence to protect themselves from this perceived threat if necessary. It is eerie to note that this group has in the past staked out a Calgary laws. That's just the reality of what we're living with. Now, they are armed, they are training, they've hosted live ammunition sessions with semi-automatic weapons across Alberta. They've scheduled bomb-making lessons, and they've showed up at rallies with, as was pointed out in the presentation, electric rods. Now, even a cursory look at the 3%ers' record in the United States should sound this alarm as this group gained strength in Canada. In 2011, a 3%ers member was caught plotting to bomb a federal building in Atlanta. In 2015, 5 Black Lives Matter protesters were shot by a member of the 3%ers. In March 2018, one of the men arrested for planning, for bombing a mosque in Minnesota ran a chapter of the 3%ers. That's why we, in light of this record and the growing chorus of experts calling for urgent action against the 3%ers, recommend that the government consider invoking Section 70 of the Criminal Code to limit the organizing capacity of this group. While there has been no recent declaration under Section 70 of the Code, there's little doubt that we live in incredible and tragic circumstances. When there's an organization that is actively drilling and preparing for this apocalyptic moment to target members of the Canadian Muslim community, steps must be taken by the federal government. So, we focus so heavily today on talking about two issues. This challenge of Islamophobia, both on the side of government policy and in terms of how it's being built through white supremacist organizations. But we can never forget, as we go forward, about the fact that every threat to our communities is a moment for us to open our hands and to invite folks in. It's a moment for us to reach out to those around us, those who hate us, those who fear us, and to say, we are here to talk. We're here to engage in dialogue. We're here to show love. We're here to show respect, because that is the way that we are being taught in our tradition. This is a tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, who, when he was being abused by the people of Ta'if, in what we really can consider to be an Islamophobia incident, prayed for their guidance. In the battle of Uhud, when he was bleeding, he prayed for his ummah. He prayed for those who were attacking him. Oh God, forgive my people, for indeed they do not know. Oh Allah, forgive my people, for indeed they do not know.
The Muslim Council of Muslim Canadians is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you, Mustafa, Farooq. Before I announce our final speaker, just another friendly reminder that membership and April 1st donation forms all are available, so you can ask any of our volunteers to help you with that. So I would now like to introduce our final speaker. He's an Islamic scholar, educator, and Muslim chaplain. At present, he's a Khatib, Imam, and religious advisor for the Muslim Councils of Calgary, and also serves as a full-time chaplain at the University of Calgary. He enjoys skiing, bike riding, and hockey. He is a very well-respected member of our community, and we are very lucky to have him speak to us today. Sheikh Imam Fayyaz will now speak about the constructive role for Muslims in secular, pluralistic, democratic society, and the social religious inhibition and constructive opportunities for the Muslim community. Please join me in welcoming Sheikh Fayyaz to lead.
Conservative role, I got her scared there. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Amma ba'du fa'a'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan ar-rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ولقد كرمنا بني آدم وقال تعالى إن الدين عند الله الإسلام وقال تعالى وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين صدق الله العظيم. I begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All praise belongs to our Creator, our Sustainer. We begin in His name, the especially merciful, the entirely merciful, the all and the eternally loving, the one who is all informed of everything that ever was, is, and will be, and everything that wasn't, isn't, and never will be, the one who has taught humanity that the world and its resources are enough for human need but not human greed. And may peace, blessings, and benedictions be showered upon all of God's prophets, messengers, and servants, from Adam and Eve and Noah to Solomon and David, and from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, to the mother of Moses, Mary, Jesus, and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May peace, blessings, and prosperity joy and jubilation be showered upon all of you, upon your families, upon this beautiful country of ours, and upon this planet of ours as well, that many billions of us all call home. I think before I begin, it's important to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Blackfoot and the land that we're actually residing on, the land that we live on, the land that we play on, the land that we work on, and that is Treaty 7 land. And before we even speak about Islam and Islamophobia and how Islamophobia is on the rise and anti-Islamic rhetoric, unfortunately, is proliferating at an alarming rate. Our tradition subscribes to universality, and the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he is and was and always will be a universal prophet. And that's why in the Quran, Allah, God Almighty, He says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا كَافَةً لِلنَّاسِ. It's a very important verse in the Quran. And that verse is, we sent Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, not to the Meccans, not to the Arabian Peninsula, not to the Eastern Hemisphere, right? But the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he was sent for all of humanity. He was sent for the entire world. And that's why our tradition, it obligates us to acknowledge that the world is one country. The world is one country. These borders are a new phenomenon. The world is one country. Humanity are its people. And doing good is our calling. Doing good is our sunnah. And I said this before and I'll say it again. Our tradition and all faith traditions, right? We are a continuation of the Abrahamic traditions. Christianity, Judaism. We subscribe to doing all the good we can, to all the people we can, whenever we can, in whatever capacity we can, as long as we ever can. And we do good for the sake of it being intrinsically and inherently virtuous. We don't do good or open the door for someone else because they opened the door for us. There is no we don't repercussate in our tradition, because we know that it is our duty, it is part of embodying the prophetic character, that when someone does bad to us, we repel that with a good. Right? Don't combat a negative with a negative. Combat a negative with a positive. No matter what the weather, always bring your own sunshine. Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, darkness can never drive out darkness, only light can do that. And that's what God says in the Quran. Repel evil with good. Repel a negative with a positive. Repel a frown with a smile. Right? Repel, subhanAllah, the middle finger with the thumbs up. Really. Right? That's what our tradition teaches us. And our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and I'll get into my topic in a bit. But our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and abundance be upon him, he was being demonized, he was being denigrated. His companions were being killed simply because they wanted to express their religion. And he was wounded in one of the incidents. A rumor spread that he was killed. And then the companions, they asked him, O Prophet of God, supplicate against those who are harming us, those who are oppressing us, right? Those who are demonizing us or denigrating us. Anybody who denigrates anybody, it has nothing to do with the person who's being denigrated, but it shows the moral decay and ignorance and lack of understanding of a person who's doing the denigrating or the demonizing, right? And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in the heat of the moment, in that particular situation, rather than supplicating against the creation of God, against his brothers, against his sisters, rather than separating between, or rather than making a wedge saying us and them, he raised his hands towards the heavens. And what did he say? He said, Allahumma ghfir li qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun. Oh Allah, guide and forgive my people. We're all one race, the human race. We're all one race, the human race. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, I mean, this was a precedent and a standard that he set. And the standard and the precedent that he said was, oh Allah, forgive my people. Because they don't know. And that's it. Look, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, and we are each other's bond. And now, perhaps more than ever, do we as human beings, every citizen, every organization, every level of government, have an obligation and responsibility to come together, to work together, and to stay together, curbing, curtailing, condemning, mitigating, and eventually eradicating all forms of hate. All forms of hate. Right? And this is important. Right? Anti-Semitism, for example, was curbed and curtailed and mitigated and eradicated by our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he heard some, it was reported that somebody was actually demonizing his better half, Safiya radiallahu ta'ala anha, because she was a Jew. She was a Jew. And it was his own people. It was people from, the Arabian Peninsula. And when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, when he came home and he realized that his wife was hurt, she was saddened, she was grieved, she was pouring her heart out. The Prophet asked, what makes you so sad? What makes you so upset? Right? And again, I challenge anyone, right? There is not a single verse or a single tradition which is anti-Semitic in our tradition. I challenge anyone. That's an open challenge, right? And she said, well, I was demonized because of my Jewish lineage. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, spoke about the Jewish lineage. He said, if anybody were to do that, it shows poor character on them and not you. That's the first thing. The second thing is, all you have to do is tell them that your father was Nabi Musa, that your father was the Prophet Moses, and your uncle was the Prophet Aaron. And if that doesn't make them reflect and contemplate as to what they're speaking about or as to how they're hurting you, then at the end tell them, and your husband was the Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So again, we all have a collective responsibility in mitigating and eradicating all forms of hate, ignorance, misogyny, bias, injustice, and discrimination. As Mother Teresa would say, I can do things you cannot, and you can do things I cannot. And that's why I really want to thank the organizers of this event. We are all interdependent on one another. I want to thank our speakers, for sharing their perspective and giving their expertise on the topic as well. She would say, again, I can do things you cannot, you can do things I cannot, but together we can do great things. The topic that I have been given to speak about is Muslim community in the pluralistic, democratic, secular Canadian society, and to address some of the Muslim inhibitions that we may have. First and foremost, words matter. Words matter. You know, Rumi would say, raise your words, not your voice. For it is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. So, as far as the word Islam is concerned, it's important to understand what the word Islam means. Look, the word Islam, words have multiple meanings. They have denotative meanings, they have contextual meanings, connotative meanings, right? There's something called nomenclature, istilah. And the word Islam, if we were to open up the Hajj word dictionary, or the Al-Mawrid, which is an authoritative dictionary in the Arabic and English language, written by a Jewish professor, Dr. Ruhi al-Ba'labaki. Dr. Ruhi al-Ba'labaki. The word Islam would be translated as commitment. Many a time we read that the word Islam is translated as submission. And according to many scholars, that's an incorrect translation of the word Islam, because the word submission has a denotative meaning. Every day I submit myself to deer for traffic. Right? Do I commit myself to deer for traffic? I don't. Maybe you do, I don't. Right? So, the word Islam actually means commitment. Right? Where did the word Islam come from? Where did the word Islam come from? So, unlike Christianity, which was named after Christ, and Christ is a Greek word. The original word was Christos, which means the anointed one. Right? And it's mentioned in the Quran, Masih, the son of Mary, right? Christianity was named after Jesus Christ. Judaism was named after the tribe of Judah. Buddhism, by extension, was named after Buddha. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who or what was Islam named after? And Islam was named after nobody, right? Islam was a name chosen by God. And anybody who commits his or herself to God, they would be considered a Muslim, right? And in my comparative religion classes, I continuously teach my students, our students, that, you know, was Abraham committed to God? They would say, yes. And was Noah committed to God? They would say, yes. And I'm like, you know what? I could actually show you a verse in the Quran which said that Islam, that Ibrahim, alayhi salatu wasalam, the Prophet Abraham, called himself a Muslim. Right? It's قَالَ لَهُ رَبُّهُ أَسْلِمْ قَالَ أَسْلَمْتُ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ وَأُمِرْتُ أَنْ أَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. So again, it's not a foreign word, right? It's not a loaded term. The word Islam simply means what? Commitment. What are you committed to? Let's break this down. What are we committed to? We're committed to two things: loving and worshiping our Creator. And how do we do that? By loving and serving His creation. That is Islam in 2 sentences. What is Islam? Right? Loving and worshiping our Creator. And how do we do that? By loving and serving His creation. So, once we've established that framework, let us now break things down, inshallah. So, secularism. Islam and secularism, they aren't mutually exclusive. That's the first thing we need to realize. Islam and secularism are mutually exclusive. It's not a heads or tails situation. Islam is definitely compatible in this type of space. And as a matter of fact, I can say that I learned the Quran in this part of the world. I was born actually in Canada. I bleed blue. For all the autonomy belief fans out there, right? I bleed blue, right? I was born here. I learned Arabic here. I learned the Quran here. I learned Islamic studies here. And I've been given the opportunity to serve in perhaps the most beautiful part in Canada, most beautiful city in Canada, which is Calgary, Alberta. So again, Islam and secularism are mutually exclusive. And Islam subscribes to this notion of pluralism. What is pluralism? Pluralism, according to the University of Calgary, is going beyond religious pluralism, is going beyond the acknowledgement of differences and working together to build a better world through reflection, engagement, and education, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he established a pluralistic city in the first year of migration. That was Medina al-Munawwara, where there were Jews, there were those who subscribed to no organized faith, and there were some Christians as well. When the Prophet came to Medina, he addressed the people. It was a very important Nas, O people, not O Muslims, O people. The first thing he said was, Afshu Salam. Afshu Salam. Establish peace. Establish peace. Community engagement and diplomacy. And then he said, وَأَطْعِمُوا الطَّعَامَ وَصِلُوا الْأَرْحَامَ. Feed people food, feed others food, and strengthen your relations, economic and social well-being. And then the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said, pray. Now, once the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he was asked, who are the greatest of people? Who are the greatest of people? And our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said, the greatest of people are those who are the most beneficial to others. And, as the English poet once said one tree can start a forest, one smile can begin a friendship, one touch can show you care, one life can make a difference. Be that difference today. And that's what Islam obligates each and every single one of us to do. Recently, the entire sports world mourned the death of an all-star. The Mamba mentality. A person who was raising 4 daughters. And as Muslims, what is our response? And sometimes due to a lack of knowledge, one may feel that we aren't allowed to offer our condolences or express our sympathies. Of course we are. Our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he taught us to offer our condolences to any family who passes away. Kobe Bryant, his daughters, they're orphaned. No matter how much money they have, they're orphaned. And our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said, "Ana wa kafirul yatim kahatayn fil jannah." Anybody who takes care of an orphan, who ensures the rights of an orphan, who ensures that they are not put in a vulnerable position, that person and I will be in close proximity in Jannah. We're allowed to speak about these things. We're allowed to offer our hand. We're allowed to say good things and good words. As a matter of fact, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he received revelation, وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, that when you speak to people, speak to them with beautiful words. Right? Give them comfort. Our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, when it came to neighbors, and it's general, whether they're Muslim neighbors, or whether they're non-Muslim neighbors, whether they're neighbors of other faiths and traditions, at the end of the day, Islam makes no distinction when it comes to neighbors. They are your neighbors. You take care of them. You support them. They say that when you're given more than what you need, rather than building a higher fence, build a longer table. That's what our tradition speaks about. Rather than building a higher fence, build a longer table. And that's why, subhanAllah, the hadith is very clear. It's Imam Bukhari, rahimahullah, sahih. He said, ما زال جبريل يوصيني بالجار حتى ظننت أنه سيورثه. And Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, the Prophet Gabriel, he continuously spoke about the rights of neighbors until I thought that my neighbors, whether they were Muslim or not, would become heirs of my estate after I would pass away. Let us agree on one thing before I end. We live in pluralistic societies. And undeniably, pluralism is an unavoidable fact. We are all equal citizens. Jazakumullah khairan for Brother Mustafa. Canada, or human beings for that matter, should not treat anyone as a second-class citizen. We all bleed red. We all bleed red. Honor, dignity, respect, kindness. Knows no nationality. Knows no religion. Knows no gender. You know, we are a human race. Until what? We were one race. Until race divided us. Politics separated us. And wealth classified us. But never once will you mention in the Quran, or will you hear in the Quran, that a person is better, or more virtuous, or meritorious because of any of those things. It's taqwa, it is character that matters. We are equal citizens, but with different cultural and religious backgrounds. So how can we, instead of being obsessed with potential conflicts of identity within communities, change that viewpoint to define and promote a common ethical framework nurtured by the richness of diverse religious and cultural backgrounds? Three things. Love. You know, I'm going to challenge the Muslims here who are in this room. There's a tradition where the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, said, none of you can completely believe until you love for your brother, you love for your sister, what you love for yourselves. Is the brotherhood or community which is mentioned in this hadith, is it speaking about brotherhood and spirituality or universal brotherhood? And I see even my Muslim brothers and sisters, there's a little hesitation when it comes to that answer. It's universal brotherhood. Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah said, al-ukhuwa fi hadha al-hadith, al-ukhuwa al-insaniyya. That the brotherhood and community which is mentioned in this particular hadith is not brotherhood which is established through faith, but it's brotherhood which is established through humanity. Humanity. And then he brings another tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, where he clarified this. And he said, Ahib linnas ma yuhibbu li nafsik. Love for people what you love for yourself. We are a community of ummati. Right? If you're successful, I am successful. If I am healthy, you are healthy. If you are happy, I am happy. This is our tradition. Number two, kindness. Be kind to anyone. Even be kind to those who are unkind to you. And I say this because our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said this, Inna Allah rafiqun yuhibbu ar-rifq. Allah is kind and He loves kindness. And the last thing I'd like to mention, which I think is perhaps the most paramount virtue in Islam, and that is knowledge. Knowledge is the greatest resource we can use to make this world a better place. I'll mention a quick story and I'll end. There were two brothers going to ship, and they called mechanic upon mechanic upon mechanic to diagnose as to why the ship wasn't starting. And all of their efforts were in vain. And they finally called upon a person who was known to have been working on ships from the age of adolescence. And he put his tools on deck, he walked downstairs into the engine room, and he examined the engine room from right to left, from top to bottom. And he said, I know what the problem is. So he comes upstairs, and he goes through his tools, and he picks out a small hammer, the size of a good Canadian loonie. And he taps the pipe. And he says, boys, start your engine. As good as new. He says, send us the bill. So he sends them the bill. The bill was for $10,000. I said, what? $10,000. $10,000. I sent us an itemized bill. I said, no problem. 2 items on the bill. Item number 1, tapping the pipe. $1.99. Item number 2, knowing where to tap the pipe. $9,998.01. Let us all bring back the sense of togetherness, collective responsibility, and unity. And again, with respect to the Canadian Muslims for peace and justice and everyone who was part of this effort, thank you for talking. Thank you for braving a conversation. It is hard to fight racism when no one is talking. Look, we all die. The goal isn't to live forever, but rather the goal is to create
Pardon me?
He's got a problem.
something
I know.
that will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know. He's trying to mock me. He gave me the finger.
Just now?
Yeah. Just so you know.
So as mentioned at the start of the event, if you had any questions, you will let any of our